Welcome to Letter to Philippi Live, our daily broadcast from Letter to Philippi, a new Messianic Jewish theological organization, going through Paul's letter to the Philippians, the letter to Philippi, Paul's letter to the people in Philippi, speaking to them about their new life in Messiah. And we can take these words given to them nearly 2,000 years ago to apply to our lives today to become more and more and more in the Messiah today. So we'll be getting started soon. We just have a few issues to get set up with our streaming, and we are going live on Facebook Live, LinkedIn Live, and YouTube Live and Instagram Live today. So we're added in LinkedIn Live. So we'll be adding a new broadcast source today. So we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 1 today, verse 1, and we'll get our streams going on Instagram, and we'll be able to get started. So this is Letter to Philippi Live, a new Messianic Jewish theological teaching organization. My name is Sean Emslie. I'm the founder of Letter to Philippi and the teacher of this class. And this is our daily, Monday through Friday, verse-by-verse study through Paul's letter to the Philippians. And if you want any information on lettertophilippi.org, just go to our website, lettertophilippi.org. There you can find all the information you want on the work of Letter to Philippi. You can read our mission statement, find out what we're about. You can watch our past class videos. You can read our Messianic Jewish book reviews. We have our prayer request form that you can add. We want to be praying for you. We have our giving form. We have our giving link to make a contribution to our work of Letter to Philippi. We are solely dependent on the giving of those who watch our classes and read our materials. We're an independent nonprofit organization. We truly appreciate if you are enjoying these classes, if you're learning more about and becoming more like the Messiah each day. You could contribute to our work with a contribution in a one-time or an ongoing contribution. We are a nonprofit organization dependent on you. And again, any information you want on Letter to Philippi, just go to lettertophilippi.org. So we'll begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll go into our study for today. Oh Lord, you're good. We thank you. We bless your holy name. We thank you for each time we get to look into your holy word. We thank you for these words we have from your holy servant Paul, Lord. Help us to take these words today as we begin anew a look at the book of Philippians, starting with verse 1 of chapter 1. Help us to become more and more and more in the Messiah today as we look into these words, apply them to our lives, and become more like our Messiah Yeshua, who is our life, and in whose holy name we pray. Amen. So again, welcome to Letter to Philippi Live. My name is Sean Emslie. I am the founder of Letter to Philippi and the teacher of this class. Letter to Philippi is a Messianic Jewish theological teaching organization of which I'm the founder, and Letter to Philippi is our first initiative. Our work is this daily class looking over the book of Philippians daily, Monday through Friday, and we will be looking to get started new initiatives. We have some exciting plans for a Passover celebration in April this year, so we're still working on that. We'll be announcing that soon. So we got a lot of exciting things we're working on, and we appreciate those who are participating in our classes here at lettertophilippi.org. So today we start back at the beginning of the book of Philippians. This is now our fifth time since June 1st of last year that we've been going through verse by verse through the book of Philippians. And today we start the fifth time through as we begin here with chapter 1. Let me get a couple quick sip of coffee, and then we'll look at our study today. So we'll be starting now with Philippians chapter 1, verse 1, beginning the book of Philippians, the letter to the people of Philippi, written by the Apostle Paul around 62 of the Common Era. In chapter 1, Paul begins this letter to the Philippians, sharing his deep love for this Messianic community. The love he has for the Philippians is grounded in their love for him and participation in his work of ministry. So there's a deep bond of love between the Philippians and Paul and the Philippians. And he begins this letter sharing about how much these people mean to him, how much they mean to him in his ministry, how much they mean to him in the work of making Messiah known. As we learned in our introduction on Friday, Philippi was the first city in Europe, first city on the European continent that Paul brought the message of Yeshua. In entering the European continent, the message of the Messiah was now reaching to the uttermost parts of the world. As Messiah Yeshua said in his command to take the message of the gospel to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the world. And at this time, going west from Jerusalem, Europe was the uttermost parts of the world, which as far as they knew of their time was Spain, which was the ending point of the world. The reaching of the Atlantic coast. So Paul here, in bringing the good news to Philippi, was bringing the message to the uttermost parts of the world. With this launch into the primary Gentile world of Europe, Paul called coming to Philippi the early days of my work spreading the good news when I left Macedonia. Though Paul had before gone to Asia Minor, which is today modern-day Turkey, now in entering into Philippi, entering into Macedonia, entering into the European continent, modern-day Greece, Paul is now seeing that it was really the beginning of his work in taking the gospel to the ends of the earth, to the ends of the known world of their time, and fulfilling that last step that Messiah Yeshua gave, to take the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world. One of the most familiar verses of this letter is in chapter 1, verses 21, which we'll be looking at in a few weeks, where Paul stresses the centrality of Yeshua in his life. Paul's whole life, from his encounter with Yeshua on the road to Damascus to his execution under Nero, was all about knowing Messiah more, becoming, as he frequently said, to be in Messiah, to be more and more and more like the Messiah. Paul will further discuss the centrality of Yeshua throughout the letter, with this being the first and foremost direct affirmation of Yeshua being his source of life now and into eternity. So we begin with verse 1, chapter 1 of Philippians, and I'll put that up on the screen. And we read, "From Shaul and Timothy, slaves of Messiah Yeshua, to all God's people united with the Messiah Yeshua and living in Philippi, along with the congregation leaders and Shamashim." So first we'll look at the phrase "from Shaul." First we have the greetings of the letter. This is basically the greetings, the opening words, basically the address label to this letter that we see his return address from Shaul and Timothy, and then the two-part of the letter, the address to all God's people in Philippi. So we begin first with "from Shaul," looking at who this Shaul is writing this letter. We read, "The writer of this letter is the Apostle Paul, also known as Shaul. The complete Jewish Bible uses the name Shaul for all references to Paul in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. Shaul was his Hebrew or synagogue name, and like other Jews of the time, he also adopted a Greco-Roman second name, Paulus, or in English, Paul. This second Gentile name was usually chosen based on a similar sound or other relationship to the Hebrew world. We see Saul, Paul, the similar sound. Saul, his Hebrew name, Shaul, his Hebrew name, and Paul or Paulus being his Greco-Roman name. The second Gentile name was usually chosen based on a similar sound or other relationship to the Hebrew name. A similar naming practice occurs today by Gentiles who convert to Judaism, or Jews who are not raised religiously, when they adopt a Jewish name related to their birth name. For example, Reuven for Robert, or Shoshana for Susan. Starting in Acts 13:9, we encounter Paul's two names. When we read, "Then Shaul, also known as Paul, filled with the Ruach HaKodesh, stared straight at him." From this point forward in Acts, Luke refers to Shaul by his Greco-Roman name, Paul, Also notice that Paul refers to himself by this name in all of his letters. Throughout this commentary, we will use the name Paul, reflecting his own use and that of other source research materials. This name change from Shaul to Paul in Acts could be understood as marking a shift of focus and field of service from Shaul, the Jewish disciple, to Paul, the apostle of Messiah, to the whole world. His globally recognized name reflecting his new global mission. This understanding is in contrast to the teaching that he changed his name from Shaul to Paul to demonstrate his rejection of Judaism and his life as a Jew to become Paul the Christian. In fact, as an educated Jew from the Pharisees, Paul would take his knowledge of the Tanakh and Jewish tradition to communicate the message about Yeshua to the Philippians. And the misunderstanding of Paul changing his name, going from being known as Shaul to beginning, as he said, with the reference in Acts 13, to be known as Paul throughout the rest of the book of Acts, and also referring himself as Paul or Paulus in all the letters that he wrote. I was a few years ago. I was watching what was to the point pretty much a good film on the life of Paul, and it for the most part the story was good. It was showing his encounter with Yeshua on the road to Damascus after his life of persecuting Jews. It started with the persecution of Stephen. Then it showed Paul's encounter with Yeshua on the road to Damascus. And as the movie was ending, which that point was a pretty good movie, showing his transformation from being a persecutor of the faith, persecutor of the Messiah, to be a proclaimer of the Messiah. In the final scene of the movie, Paul was leaving to go out to present the message of Messiah to the larger world, leaving Antioch. And people saw him and said, "Oh, look, it's Shaul, the one who persecuted us." And Paul, and the character playing Paul, the actor playing Paul, says, "No, I am not Shaul the Jew. I am Paul the Christian." And they basically ruined the whole film for me. So that they was making this declaration that his name change was a matter of him rejecting his place as a Jew and his place of becoming a Christian. But Paul's name change, and a better way of understanding it, is that primarily using Paulus is the matter of his changed mission. Shaul, who was the learner about the Messiah, the one who was the persecutor who became a Talmud of Yeshua. And now his change of mission from being a learner to being a proclaimer, and now going into the Gentile world using a familiar Gentile name, a familiar name in the Greco-Roman Paulus rather than the unfamiliar Hebrew Shaul. This name change was a matter of a change of mission from being Shaul the learner to Paul the proclaimer. And we look and Timothy. So we see that in this letter, the letter is addressed from Paul and Timothy to the people in Philippi. Timothy was one of the most loyal co-workers who joined Paul as he began his second journey to Asia Minor, the Messianic communities of Asia Minor, bringing the word of the Jerusalem Council that the Gentiles can come to faith in Yeshua solely based on their embrace of Yeshua as Messiah, their rejection of sin, their seeking of repentance, and would not have to convert to Judaism as the teachers from Antioch were coming to, and the teachers in Jerusalem were saying that the Gentiles had to convert to Judaism, become followers of Yeshua. With the word of the Jerusalem Council, the way was open to the Gentiles to come from pagan Gentiles to redeemed Gentiles by their faith, trust alone in Yeshua. And so the purpose of this mission was to bring this message to the Gentile world, that the way for them to come into the people of God has been opened up through the work of the Messiah. And by faith alone in Yeshua, they could come to God from being pagan Gentiles to redeemed Gentiles, and would not have to convert to Judaism to become fully part of the people of God. And we first find out a little bit about Timothy and about his going with Paul on the mission to Philippi in Acts 16. Acts 16 was where Paul had his first journey, his first visit to Philippi, where he established the Messianic community in Philippi. And we will read that here on about Paul and Timothy. Shaul, as I said, the Complete Jewish Bible uses Shaul throughout the whole book of Philippians of Acts. So we, as the basis. Though I'll be using Paul throughout, in the quotes from the Complete Jewish Bible, Shaul is the language that keeps continuous throughout the book. Shaul came down to Derbe and went on to Lystra, where there lived a Talmud named Timothy. He was the son of a Jewish woman who had come to trust in a Greek father. All the brothers in Lystra and Iconium spoke well of Timothy. Shaul wanted Timothy to accompany him, so he took him and did a Brit Milah because of the Jews living in those areas, for they had heard that his father had been a Greek. As they went on through the towns, they delivered to the people the decision reached by the emissaries and elders in Jerusalem for them to observe. So we see in this brief introduction to Timothy as Paul was on his way to Philippi, we see that he was born of a Jewish mother, he had a Greek father, and his Greek father did not have him circumcised at birth. And so Paul, before he left for the bringing the message to Asia Minor again about the announcement of the Jerusalem Council, he had Timothy as an adult circumcised. So in essence, to complete his identification as a Jew and to remove any doubt of him being a Jew as they were bringing the message of the Messiah, firstly to the Jewish communities in the cities that they visited, and then to the Gentile community. In this introduction, we see that Timothy was the son of a Greek father and a Jewish mother who had become a believer in Yeshua. And in Timothy, in the letter to Timothy, 2 Timothy 1:5, we also find out that his grandmother Eunice was also a Messianic Jew, making him a third-generation Messianic Jew, with both his mother and grandmother being Yeshua followers. So in this first generation of Yeshua faith, he was in essence the third generation of his family who had embraced the Messiah. Though we do not know why Timothy was not circumcised, it appears from the text that his Greek father may have objected to having his son circumcised, possibly because of the Greek ascetic ideal of not desecrating the perfect human form by removing the foreskin. So one of the reasons why Timothy more than likely was not circumcised as a child was that his father was Greek, and the Greek mindset was that the human body was perfect in its own. So in doing a Brit Milah, in doing a ritual circumcision, and removing the foreskin, they were in essence marring the perfect human form. So that was one from an aesthetic point of view why the Greeks, his Greek father would reject him being circumcised. And another reason would also be the fact that it would be a matter of separating him from Gentile society, whereas the Gentile society, the man would be uncircumcised, and his son would be set apart because he was circumcised. And in our world today, it doesn't seem that big thing to question whether publicly whether a man is circumcised or uncircumcised. But in the world of the first century, there was more exposure to whether someone was circumcised or not because of the communal bathhouses and other such things. So they would actually notice that Timothy was different if he had been circumcised as a as a child. So we have two basic reasons why Timothy was not circumcised as a child. One, because it would be against the aesthetic of the perfect human body and Greek mindset, and also because it would set him as different from the rest of the society, in essence, being not conforming to the norms of society by being circumcised, whereas the rest of the male populace would be uncircumcised. So these are two ways of understanding why his father did not have him circumcised, and then Paul would circumcise him as an adult. To prevent any confusion over Timothy's status as a Jew, or any issue among the Jewish community and synagogues on their journey to Asia Minor that could disrupt the gospel work, the message of the Messiah being disrupted because of the question over those people knowing that Timothy was born to a Jewish mother, but was uncircumcised. Paul had him circumcised so that ambiguity would be taken away. That Timothy would be seen as fully a part of the Jewish covenant, the covenant with Abraham. Paul did not want Timothy's possibly ambiguous Jewish identity. There was a roadblock in the work of sharing their message among the Jewish populace of Asia Minor. The fact that Timothy was Jewish and uncircumcised would have caused a stumbling block to the mission of sharing the Jewish Messiah with his fellow Jews. Paul demonstrated Timothy's importance to him as a co-worker and disciple by mentioning Timothy in 8 of his letters, and Timothy himself also received 2 of Paul's letters. Paul may have included Timothy in the greeting portion of letters to indicate that Timothy functioned as his secretary, who physically wrote the letter as Paul dictated to him. Paul also endorsed Timothy's authority as a leader by including him in the opening greeting. So we see here three things that Paul was doing in including Timothy as the one sending this letter, the one in the return label of this letter, that he was showing that Timothy was a co-worker with him and sharing that he was one working side by side with him. He's also could be showing that Timothy was the one who wrote this letter down as Paul dictated to him. And for the people in Philippi, Paul was also demonstrating that Timothy was a leader and was one who could be seen by them as a proxy for him in leadership, one who bears the authority of Paul to bring this message to them and to bring the good news of the Messiah, that he would be seen as a leader in the Messianic community with the authority of Paul to bring this message to them. So as we said, Paul demonstrated Timothy's importance to him as a co-worker and disciple by mentioning Timothy in 8 of his letters, of which 2 were himself received from Paul, the letters to 1st and 2nd Timothy. And Paul here included Timothy in his greeting to indicate that Timothy functioned as a secretary, and also he endorsed Timothy's authority as a leader by including him in the opening. Next, we see the phrase slaves of Messiah Yeshua. Paul refers to himself and to Timothy as slaves of the Messiah. This self-identification is an essential precursor to one of the essential themes of the book, namely that followers of Yeshua were to model Yeshua's humility and willingness to be a slave, a humble servant willing to give their life for the Messianic community. Paul used the Greek word for slave, doulos, to refer to Yeshua later in Philippians 2, verse 7. Given the nature of life in the Roman Empire and a major city such as Philippi, the Philippians would be familiar with slavery and what it meant in their society to be a slave. In the use of douloi for slaves, to represent himself and Timothy, and later referred to Yeshua as a doulos, or slave, in the Messianic hymn of chapter 2, Paul's making clear to the Philippians what following Yeshua means and what the model for their new life entails. The Theological Dictionary of the New Testament This is the word doulos means that the service offered by the slave is performed out of submission and dependence on the master. This description certainly applies to Paul and Timothy, who were entirely devoted to their master Yeshua, to their Lord Yeshua. For Paul, being a slave of Messiah was a wholehearted, joyful act of submission to Yeshua as his Lord. Being a slave of Messiah was to Paul the realization of true freedom. Let me read that again. For Paul and Timothy, and for those who truly seek to emulate them and emulate being a true Talmud of Yeshua, for Paul, being a slave of Messiah Yeshua, was a wholehearted, joyful act of submission to Yeshua as his Lord. Being a slave of Messiah was to Paul the realization of true freedom. And we see this in Romans 6:22. I'll put that up on the screen. And I read, however now, freed from sin and enslaved to God, you do get the benefit. It consists in being made holy, set apart for God, and it ends in eternal life. Let me read that verse again. However now, freed from sin and enslaved to God, you do get the benefit. It consists of being made holy, set apart for God, and it ends in eternal life. The end result is eternal life. Paul's enslavement was no longer to sin and death, but to Yeshua and life, both now and eternally. In his slavery to Yeshua, he was truly free from enslavement to sin. So Paul here is talking about him and Timothy being slaves of the Messiah Yeshua, those who have entered into such connection and such service, such willing service to the Messiah, that they have enslaved themselves to the Messiah. They are doulos, individually, douloi, together. They are bond slaves of the Messiah. They're ones who have given themselves totally over to their master, Yeshua. And in so doing, they have left enslavement to sin and death by their faith trust in Yeshua, by their exchanging of enslavement to sin and death, to take on enslavement to Yeshua and life eternal and the full atonement that he provides. Paul accepts a new enslavement, an enslavement that ensures life eternal in the Messiah, and no longer enslaved to sin, but now enslaved to the Messiah Yeshua, which means life eternal because of the atoning work of Yeshua. That Paul has exchanged one enslavement, an enslavement that leads to death, for now a new enslavement by his faith trust in Yeshua, to enslavement to Yeshua and being a true doulos of Messiah Yeshua, someone who was completely given themselves over to the lordship of Messiah and has exchanged death for life, has taken on a new master. His old master would have been sin and death. His new master is life eternal in Yeshua, embraced by the Messiah and covered in the atoning work of Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. Though it was detrimental to call oneself a slave in Greek and Roman cultures, Paul is teaching a lesson to the Philippians on the critical role of being considered a slave to the Messiah, echoing the use of servant as a title of honor to someone chosen for service by the Lord in the Tanakh. So Paul here is taking on himself this despicable calling to call himself a slave, to take on himself that I am a doulos, I am a slave, I am one who is seen as the lowest of society, but in that world, taking on that role, taking on that eponym that they were a slave, that they were a slave to the Messiah, whereas whereas there was so much importance of being free in Roman society, Paul here is saying, I'm intentionally making myself a slave, as my Messiah Yeshua, which we'll see in Philippians chapter 2, the enslavement of the Messiah for our atoning, where the Messiah became as a servant into our world, as came in our world as a slave and died as a slave for our atonement. There was a detrimental to call oneself a slave in Greek and Roman cultures. Paul here is teaching a lesson to the Philippians on the critical role of being considered a slave to the Messiah. And Paul here can be seen as echoing the servant language, the servant titles and honor for those who serve the Lord in the Tanakh. The Hebrew word eved as a servant or slave of Hashem. In Greek, the Greek word doulos is the word translated for slave or servant in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Tanakh that was done in the late part of the before Common Era period, before the coming of Yeshua, and use the word doulos to translate the Hebrew word eved throughout the Tanakh for Moses, a righteous teacher, Joshua, David, in the verses is speaking of them as being an Eved Hashem, as them being a servant of God. There's this translation from the Hebrew Eved translating into the Greek doulos. We can see a connection between those who are called an Eved, a servant of God, a slave of God, in the Tanakh. As I said, as Moshe Rabbeinu, Joshua, David, and others, with the slaves of the Brit Hadashah, the doulos, the douloi of the Brit Hadashah, Paul, Timothy, and by their example, the believers in Philippi. So Paul makes clear that he is a slave of Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah. His devotion to Yeshua is central to his self-identification. It is in finding and submitting himself to the Jewish Messiah, to Yeshua, that Paul sees meaning in his life. And he stated clearly here that this is the only proper response to his encounter with the Messiah, and this subjection to him as a slave. His identification as a slave of Yeshua motivated him to model Yeshua and commend this way of life to the Philippians. Let me read the last paragraph in those powerful words. Paul makes clear that he is a slave of Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah. Yeshua. His devotion to Yeshua is central to his self-identification. It is in finding and submitting himself to the Jewish Messiah that Paul sees meaning in his life. He stated clearly here, this is his only proper response to his encounter with the Messiah, is his subjection to him as a slave. Paul understands that his only response, the only response he can have to his encounter with Yeshua, is subjecting himself willingly as a slave of Messiah Yeshua. His identification as a slave of Yeshua motivated him to model Yeshua and commend the way of life to the Philippians. As Paul was a slave of the Messiah, as Timothy was a slave of the Messiah, Paul and Timothy are calling the people of Philippi to them accept their place as slaves of the Messiah Yeshua. And we continue on looking at this. Now we're moving from the from part of the letter, from the return label. Now we're looking to the address label, where Paul says, to all God's people united with Messiah and living in Philippi. Paul wrote the letter to the people in Philippi, a city which is now in the modern country of Greece. It is also the first city in Europe, on the European continent, where Paul visited and established a Messianic community. As seen earlier, Paul had a minimal Jewish, as we saw earlier, Philippi had a minimal Jewish population. So Paul was writing to a mostly Gentile Messianic community. Though there would have been some Jews and God-fearers who were members of the community, as we see from the first encounter with people in Philippi, with the women who were praying on the Sabbath at the riverside, including Lydia, who became the first believer in Yeshua, who was either a God-fearer or a convert to Judaism, but she came to faith in Yeshua and was part of the the women who were practicing Judaism and praying on Shabbat. But for the most part, there was just a small group of women. And as I said on yesterday, it wasn't until the 4th century, around 350 of the Common Era, that is record of a synagogue being in Philippi. So there were nearly 300 years after Paul went to Philippi until there was an established synagogue in Philippi. The phrase "all God's people" is rendered "all God's holy people" in some other translations. The Greek word hagios, sometimes translated as holy ones or saints, is used in the Septuagint to translate the Hebrew word kadosh. Paul Within Judaism scholar Mark Nano sees in this phrase "all God's holy people" Paul's continuing connection to his Pharisaic Jewish life, holiness within that life, and his desire for the Philippians to be holy. So Mark Nanos, a brilliant Jewish scholar on Paul, sees that Paul here, in using the word hagios, holy ones or saints, was reflecting on his life understanding from the Pharisaic community, focusing on personal holiness, and holiness being the focus of the life of a Jew. He also understands that Paul is bringing these Gentiles in Philippi into a life of holiness, walking a new way of life for them within the context of Jewish understanding and framework for their Yeshua life, even as they remain Gentiles. So Nanos also sees that Paul, in calling them saints, calling them holy, is also showing that they have come into a new life from their pagan background to now living within a faith following the God of Israel and within the space within Jewish space with the Jewish Messiah and the Jewish scriptures, that they were leaving their pagan background to enter into Jewish space and Jewish religious background, Jewish religious faith in the Messiah of Israel. And then we come to the phrase unique to this book where Paul says in the greeting, along with the congregation leaders in Shamashim. Congregation leaders and the Shamashim, those of which we see the elders and the deacons in the community. Congregation leaders, the elders, the senior leaders, the senior rabbis, the senior pastors, and the Shamashim being the deacons, those who serve with the leaders of the congregation. Paul makes a point to include in this opening words a greeting to both the congregational leaders and Shamashim. In doing so, Paul is showing that there was an established leadership over the community in Philippi. Paul wanted to alert these leaders on their roles and responsibilities, to learn from Paul as overseer for all the Messianic communities, and also teach the people under their spiritual care in Philippi to walk in God's ways. The role of elder at synagogue was familiar from Jewish practice. The original 12 Talmudim, students, disciples of Yeshua, the apostles, would have led in the early Messianic community in Jerusalem and served as a continuation of this established practice. They were joined by Yaakov, James, the brother of Yeshua, who became the leader of the Jerusalem Messianic community. These elders were to be devoted to the spiritual needs of the Messianic community, and to continue this focus, they chose Shamashim, dedicated to the physical demands of the Messianic community. Paul in 1 Timothy 3, 1-13, and Titus 1:6 give a listing of requirements for those to be elders in Shamashim. We can see in Acts 14:23, from Paul's first missionary journey, that he established elders and communities that he founded. I'll put that up on the screen. And we read, after appointing elders for them, I should put it up on the screen. After appointing elders for them in every congregation, Shaul and Barnabas, with prayer and fasting, committed these to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. Let me read that again. After appointing elders for them in every congregation, Shaul and Barnabas, with prayer and fasting, committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. From the example, we can understand that Paul and Timothy in Philippi, as recorded in Acts 16, would have chosen elders over Let me start that again. From this example, we can understand that Paul and Timothy in Philippi, as recorded in Acts 16, would have chosen elders over the Messianic community in Philippi, which they began on their first trip to Philippi on Paul's second missionary journey. In referring to the congregational leaders in this greeting, Paul could be making them aware of his message to the community, especially in Paul's reference to false teachers and false teachings as described in Acts 3:1-11. They, as the spiritual leaders in the community, were to stand for the truth of the gospel and against the false teaching, like shepherds over a flock. So Paul, in highlighting in this opening greeting, calling on the elders and the deacons, the congregational leaders and the shamashim, the zachanim and the shamashim, to listen to his letter, to pull them out specifically as one's reference to this letter. Paul could be calling them to understand that he's going to be speaking about leadership issues in this letter, issues of dealing with false teaching, that their work as shepherds of the community were to stand against false teaching, stand against those who are preaching a false gospel, those who are preaching against the words of the apostles, and that they, as shepherds of the community, like shepherds over their sheep, were to protect their flock from the wolves who are bringing in false teaching. And also, as we'll see in chapter 4, there's a question of disagreement, disunity among leaders. And Paul was calling the leadership to be listening to the words of the letter, to be listening to their responsibility to deal with this issue of disunity in the community. So we see Paul, this is the one letter that Paul wrote that included a reference to the elders and the shamashim, the elders and the deacons in the opening words. And as I said, we have issues of false teachers in this book in chapter 3, and the disunity among leadership in chapter 4, specific issues of the leaders, those in leadership position in Philippi, needed to deal with. So Paul, in his opening words of the letter, wants to make sure that they're listening to this letter and will confront the false teachers and will confront the disunity among the leaders in the community to bring the community completely together around the true gospel and on unity in the Messiah. Given that one of Paul's motivations for writing the letter was to thank the Philippians for their gifts to him, Paul here could also be greeting the letters of the community, thanking them for their collecting and distributing the contributions to him from the Philippians. So Paul also could be mentioning this specifically because this is the one community, the one Messianic community, the one city that actually sent him financial gifts. So he could also be calling out the leaders, thanking them specifically for them collecting the gifts and sending them to them, and also sending Epaphroditus, who we'll see later in the letter. Though a fully formed congregational leadership structure in the early Messianic community is understood to be a later development, and we see this in D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo's introduction to the New Testament, it appears from this greeting that at least in Philippi, a congregational structure, including congregational leaders, shamashim, existed. Although this structure in Philippi was not a common organizational structure among the Messianic communities, among the churches, until the 2nd century of the Common Era, some commentators suggest that this structure, this established structure of leadership structure, which would have been seen as later development in the Messianic communities and churches, the suggestion of this structure could have been developed earlier in Philippi based on the cultural desire and official leadership structure from the Roman influence of the city. So Philippi may have developed a more formalized structure within their congregations than the other congregations around the world, based on them being a Roman colony and so used to the established understanding of a leadership structure of all of life based on them being a Roman colony. So Philippi could have had a more established structure of congregational leaders, deacons, elders, and then the other communities that would have had because of just the influence of the Roman colony that they were living in. From Acts 16 and the letter to the Philippians, we learn of several leaders by name in the Philippian Messianic community, including Lydia, who was the first believer in Philippi, Euodia, Syntyche, Syzygus, Clement, and the other fellow workers of Paul. So we see that there were those who were established leaders in the community, starting with Lydia, who was the first believer in Yeshua in Philippi, and who established the first Messianic community, the first house church in her home. And we'll see Euodia and Syntyche and Syzygus and Clement and the other fellow workers of Paul mentioned in the 4th chapter of this letter. So there appears that there was an established leadership structure in Philippi, which was unique to them in the first century of the Common Era. But as I said, it could be based on them being a Roman colony and being that a structured life was part of the culture. So Paul here, in concluding his words of introduction, his words of basically, as I said, the return label and the address label of this letter is calling out the leadership in Philippi, the congregational leaders and the shamashim, the elders and the deacons, the clergy and those who are in spiritual leadership, to listen up to the letter, because he has special issues for the leaders to hear about, for them in chapter 3 to confront false teaching, confront those who are bringing another gospel about Yeshua, and that they as leaders need to protect the flock as shepherds protect their flocks from the wolves and the lions. Paul is calling the leadership in Philippi to protect their people from the false teachings that were coming to them. And as we see in chapter 4, he's also calling the leadership to come set up and to deal with the issue of disunity between the two leaders, we say Euodia and Syntyche, two of the leaders in the community that were in disagreement. And Paul there will call the leadership to come beside them and bring them together for their own personal unity, their own personal spiritual life, but also for the spiritual unity and spiritual life of the whole Messianic community in Philippi. So we see two important later leadership issues in chapter 3, dealing with false teaching, and chapter 4, doing disunity among leaders, as Paul is going to reflect on and challenge them to deal with. We see in these opening words, in the return label, in the address label to this letter, Paul calling out the leadership in the community. Listen, I've got important issues for the whole community to hear throughout the book, as I'll be sharing, but especially for the leaders. Listen out for the teaching on dealing with false teachers, and also for unity in the community. So we see this here, as I said, chapter 1, verse 1, being the return label and the address label to this letter, the Paul sent to the Philippians. And I'll read the whole thing again as we conclude, because it's always good to read the words. So this is what we looked at today, chapter 1, verse 1 of Philippians. And I'll read it again here. And it says, "From Shaul and Timothy, slaves of the Messiah Yeshua, to all God's people united with the Messiah Yeshua and living in Philippi, along with the congregation leaders and shamashim." So here we've seen that Paul and Timothy were sent this letter to the people in Philippi, this community that means so much to both Paul and to Timothy, as they established the community, as we see in Acts chapter 16. And this letter is being sent to all God's people in Philippi, and also to the leaders and the shamashim, to cause them to also to be aware to listen to specific issues of leadership that they have to deal with, false teaching, which we see in chapter 3, and disunity among leaders in chapter 4. And he calls the whole community to become more and more and more in the Messiah, and to understand their lives as redeemed Gentiles and Messianic Jews for those Jews who were in the community. So there was a small Jewish community in Philippi, but the first believer in the community was Lydia, who was from the God-fearers, from Gentiles who had embraced Judaism. So here we see this community of faith coming together, and Paul calling them in his letter to them near the end of his life, before his execution in Nero, calling them to understand their new life in the Messiah, to strengthen themselves in their faith and to become more and more and more like Yeshua, who is the model of life, humility, and self-sacrifice, the model that they are to model themselves after. As Paul modeled the Messiah, they were to model the Messiah in their life. And we'll see that as we look more and more into this book, as we go verse by verse through Paul's letter to the Philippians. So again, this is a letter to Philippi Live, a new Messianic Jewish theological teaching organization. And Letter to Philippi Live is our daily broadcast at 12 p.m. Pacific Time, 1 p.m. Phoenix Time, 2 p.m. Chicago Time, 3 p.m. Winter Park Time, and 10 p.m. Jerusalem Time, and also known as 10 p.m. Johannesburg Time. So for those in South Africa who are watching, it's 10 p.m. It's actually the same time zone as Jerusalem, and that was fascinating. I found out I'm actually going to be getting work on a PhD in theology at the South African Theological Seminary near Johannesburg. So I came to try to figure out what the time zone was, and it happened to be the same time zone as Jerusalem, 10 hours ahead of Los Angeles. So again, we're daily Monday through Friday on Facebook Live, Instagram Live, YouTube Live, and we've now added LinkedIn Live. So thank you for watching. Again, this is lettertophilippi.org. Lettertophilippi.org is where you can watch past class videos. You can ask any questions you have. We have a contact form. You can leave prayer requests when we're praying for you. You can read our mission statement and find out what Letter to Philippi is all about. We're Messianic Jewish book reviews. We have our statement of faith. We'll go through what we believe as Messianic Jews, what we believe here at Letter to Philippi, how we understand the God of Israel, the Messiah of Israel, the Torah of Israel, and the people of Israel, and how we live our lives following the Messiah within the life of Judaism, living our lives as Messianic Jews, and for those from the nations who have been drawn to sojourn with the people of Israel, to work alongside us. I, as a Messianic Jew, focusing my life, living my life as a Jewish follower, a Jewish Talmud, a Messiah Yeshua. So thank you for watching. Also, I not to be remiss, but we also have our giving link on our site. We're an independent, non-profit organization. We truly appreciate those who watch our classes, watch our videos, participate in our other materials to make a contribution to our work. On this giving link, you can make a one-time contribution, or even better, if you could set up an ongoing contribution, so we'll have ongoing funds to keep this work going as we continue to expand our broadcast to new formats, new sites, and also as we're looking to exciting new projects upcoming. We have some exciting projects for Passover coming up in April, so we'll be announcing those things too, and we'll let you know when that information is coming. We should be having something by March 1st to give you an announcement of our online observances and live observance of Passover and the final day Passover for Seudat Mashiach, a final meal of Passover focused on Messiah Yeshua. And I said more information will be coming on March 1st for that. So thank you for watching. Again, this is Letter to Philippi Live. We're a Messianic Jewish theological teaching organization. My name is Sean Emslie. I'm the founder of Letter to Philippi and the teacher of this class. Again, if you want more information on Letter to Philippi, go to lettertophilippi.org. Thank you for watching. Shalom. And tomorrow we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 1, verse 2, as we move into continuing on. And Paul gives some more words to the people of Philippi. I'll give them to you now. Verse 2 reads, "Grace to you and shalom from God our Father and the Lord Yeshua, the Messiah." Shalom. See you tomorrow as we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 1, verse 2, here on Letter to Philippi, a new Messianic Jewish theological teaching broadcast coming to you Monday through Friday, 12 p.m. Pacific Time, from Letter to Philippi, a new Messianic Jewish theological teaching organization, lettertophilippi.org. Shalom, blessings. Have a great day, and see you tomorrow as we look at Philippians chapter 1, verse 2. Shalom.